Okay, welcome to the American Evolution Part 6. Now we're going to take a look at the legislative branch. Now for the legislative branch, we have to break this into two components. And the first of these that we're going to take a look at is the U.S. Senate. When we look at the U.S. Senate, this is the aristocratic aspect of the legislative branch, right? The Senate represents the states. In fact, this is why you have equal representation. Little Rhode Island has 2 senators, and so does the state of Texas, right? Even though they're significantly different in size, it's different. It's equal representation, right? Each state is equally represented. They're indirectly elected, right? The senators are selected by each state legislature. Now, it's not like that today, right? But we have to get to the 17th Amendment before that changes. In the original Constitution, the states themselves would decide who the senators are. So when we take a look at things like, for example, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, they weren't trying to convince the people of Illinois to vote for them to the U.S. Senate. They were trying to convince the Illinois legislature or the incoming legislature to vote for them to go to the U.S. Senate, right? 6-year terms. Now, remember what I said before. The longer the term, the less democratic it is, right? Now, their articles, along with the House as well, is listed in Article 1 of the Constitution. That's where their powers are listed, right? Now, this is the aristocratic aspects of it. We need to take a look at now the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives is the only portion of the original Constitution that is an actual, true democracy, right? The House of Representatives represents the people. You have short terms, right? Very short terms, 2 years. That means you have frequent elections, right? That is more democratic. The more elections, the more democratic it is, right? You have, they're elected directly from the people, the popular vote. From the very beginning, the popular vote of the people will select who these representatives are, right? Now, you do have property qualifications in existence back then. As a matter of fact, suffrage was what was really limited at this time. In order for you to vote, you had to meet 4 criteria. You had to be a man. You had to be an adult. You had to be white, and you had to be a landowner. Those are the 4 criteria. And we'll see as we move forward in this course that those criteria will loosen up and change as we move along. But the belief at this time, at least, was that those with property had what was called, this is Thomas Jefferson's quote here, a stake in society, right? They needed to have the power to in the suffrage because they had a stake in society because they owned land. Now again, when it comes to this branch, there's a series of compromises. And of course, the most notable one is the compromise on representation themselves, right? The larger states, if you remember from the Virginia Plan, wanted proportional representation, that the number of representatives in both houses, the Senate or the House, should be based on the population. The larger your population, the more power you should have. But of course, the small states didn't like that idea at all. They wanted state representation, an equal share of the power. They still wanted to hold on to that we are a little country. Remember, this is why Rhode Island isn't even there. They know that they're going to lose some power in whatever this new document is, right? Now, they are going to eventually come up with a compromise on this, right? And we refer to it as the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. I'm going to touch on that again in a second, but there's another compromise that had to be made when it came to the representation. When the decision was made that they would have at least one house that had proportional representation, then the question got asked was, well, how do we count for that representation? Especially when it came to slaves. Now, for a Southerner, it was simple. A slave is a person. It's a human, so it counts as 1. 1 slave equals 1 person towards representation. But a Northerner would go, but they're property. They don't get to count as any. They count as 0, right? We don't get to count our horses. Slaves are chattel. Chattel just means living property, right? So that makes them no different than a horse. We don't get to count our horses. You don't get to count your slaves. So the debate goes back and forth. Now, this was an opportunity back then to go ahead and address the issue of slavery as a whole in the nation. What they decided to do instead, though, was to put the issue off. Both sides did give something up, though. The slaves aren't going to count as a whole individual, but they're not going to count as zero either. Right? The 3/5 clause will be added to the Constitution. There's two things that get added because of all this. First of all, when it comes to representation, slaves count as 3/5 of a person. So the South gets more representation based on the number of slaves they have, right? They get some extra there. On the flip side, too, they also count towards taxation. Right? But also, as a result of this will come what becomes Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, which actually protects the industry of slavery, right? When it talks about fugitive slaves. And this is something that's going to come up time and time again as we move forward in this course. Now, when we take a look at the Great Compromise that decided that we were going to have two houses, one that represents the state, the Senate, one that represents the people, the House. Well, we call it the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, but in reality, it was really just the Great Narrow Plurality. That's what I like to call it anyways. It passed, but only by a majority vote of 5-4. There was a lot of contentious arguments over how the houses should be divided up, right? So when it finally did come down to a vote, and they finally just had to say, look, this is what we got, let's just vote on it. You only had 10 states present the day that they voted, 5 voted in favor, 4 voted against, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts had the Massachusetts delegation so embroiled in arguments amongst themselves that they didn't even vote at all.